So last week, just to jog your memories, last week we talked about how Jacob really encountered God, meeting with him while he was camping outside at this place called Bethel, and uh, and how God stepped in and he met with him, and this encounter with God changed Jacob's life. And as a review, the 3 points of that sermon were that a life that has been changed by God is marked by a new fear of the Lord, a new belief in God, and new affections, that the priorities of their heart has been changed. Um, and today, as we follow Jacob in his story, we're going to continue in what it looks like to have a fear of God. What does it look like to really trust God in your life? And last week, as I briefly talked about the fear of the Lord, I talked about how fearing God means that worldly fears that you have, they change. That the problems that you have, the things that cause you stress and anxiety, and all those problems that feel so heavy on your shoulders, when we come before God's presence and we really behold the glory of God, those things, our perspective about them changes and our perception changes, and they kind of shrink in our eyes, and God grows, right? And this is has a lot to do with what it looks like to really trust God in our day-to-day lives. But then there's this question that we need to answer, and that question is that this sounds really good. It sounds really good to trust in God. It sounds really good to fear God and believe in Him when everything's going well, and when everything's going happy and everything is the way that we think it's supposed to be. It's really easy to say, like, yep, I trust in God. But what happens when life gets really hard? What happens when things get really difficult? And the question that we have to answer is this kind of fear of the Lord, is that only something that can apply when we live in nice neighborhoods in developed nations where injustice and exploitation and violence are abnormal, right? Or does fearing God actually work when you have real opposition and real enemies? Right? Does it make sense to put our trust in an intangible and invisible God when we have real enemies trying to assail us and really mess with our lives? Does it work out, right? Is this just a nice theory that exists on paper, or is this something that can actually impact our day-to-day lives, especially in times of trouble? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we have to fill in a little bit of the story of what happened since the last time that we talked. Remember, the reason that Jacob was camping out outside at Bethel was because he was running away from his brother Esau. And he was running away because Esau was threatening to kill him after Isaac died. So Jacob finally arrives at the tents of his uncle, so his mother Rebekah's brother. But contrary to what Rebekah was hoping for, and contrary to what she was expecting, Laban, her brother, was a snake. He was like a really sneaky, conniving kind of guy. If Jacob used to be someone who was known to be a trickster, Laban was like 10 times worse. Right? And so Jacob lives with him for about a month and is working for him. And then Laban says to him, like, listen, you've been living with me for a month and you've been working for me. I don't want you to work for free. Tell me what you want me to pay you. And Jacob, during that time that he was there, he fell in love with Laban's youngest daughter named Rachel. And he said, listen, Uncle Laban, I don't have any money on me. It's all back at home with my mom, but I really love your daughter and I want to marry her. So, can I work for you for 7 years? For 7 years worth of my labor, can I pay the bride price for her. And Laban says, hey, that sounds like a good idea. That's my precious younger daughter, 7 years. That sounds fair. And so for 7 years, Jacob worked for his uncle, but the Bible says that he loved Rachel so much it felt like just a couple days, right? That's Korean drama romance right there, right? And then finally the day comes that it's time to get married, and then he goes to his uncle. He's like, I worked 7 years. It's time to get married. And Uncle Laban says, that's exactly right, nephew. And so he throws this big wedding feast. He throws a big wedding feast, and a wedding feast for these people lasted 1 week. And on the first night is when they're supposed to have their wedding ceremony, and they get together. So everyone's partying, everyone's having a good time, and then in the evening, Jacob goes into his tent, and they hand him his bride, and then they go to sleep, and they lay with each other. And the next morning, Jacob wakes up, and he's shocked to find out that the person laying next to him isn't Rachel, the woman that he loved, the woman that he worked for, but instead it's Rachel's older sister, Leah. And he's like, what in the world? And he gets up, and he's angry and shocked, and he feels violated, and he goes to his Uncle Laban, and he's like, Uncle Laban, I work for Rachel. What is Leah doing here? And Uncle Laban says, too bad, buddy. In our culture, among our people, we don't usually marry off the younger daughter until the oldest daughter is first married. So you married Leah instead. And Jacob's like, what? How is that fair? What in the world? And Laban says, but if you want to marry Rachel still, then how about this? I'll also give you my daughter Rachel, and then once this wedding feast is over, you'll be married to both of them, and you'll work for me another 7 years, right? And Laban obviously is taking advantage of the fact that he knows that Jacob really, really loves Rachel, and he knows that Jacob isn't going to say no. So Jacob is like, okay, I guess so. So for 14 years, he works for his uncle and now father-in-law Laban in order to have both of his daughters as wives. Right? That's the kind of person that Laban is, right? And immediately, Jacob's personal, family life is thrown into chaos. Because imagine this, right? Imagine Rachel and Leah are sisters. They've already grown up in the same family. Their entire lives, they've been competitive. They've been squabbling with each other the way that siblings do. But then they get married to the same man, right? And in that marriage, all of their jealousy, all of their competition just intensifies like crazy, right? And so Jacob's family life turns into this ugly, gross competition among the sisters, that they're trying to compete, oh, he loves me more, oh, he doesn't love you, oh, I have more sons, oh, you don't have any children. And they fight with each other and fight with each other. And any third-party observer would look at Jacob's life and say wow, man, your Uncle Laban really screwed you over, right? The entire trajectory of your life was just ruined by this one dishonest act by your uncle, right? And anyone reading this story might sit there and think wait, I thought God met with him, right? I thought God met Jacob, and I thought God said, I'll be with you wherever you go, and I'm going to bless you. So why did God let Laban just completely screw up Jacob's life like this, right? What is God doing here, right? And so as we unravel this story and as we read into this story a little bit more, our goal in reading this is trying to answer the question, is it viable for real life? I'm not talking about life as we want it to be, right? Life where everything is the way that we think it's supposed to be. But when the poop hits the fan, when life gets really messy and ugly, is it viable for us to put our trust in God? Right? Does that make sense to put trust in God when life gets ugly like this, right? So The way that I've structured this sermon is that we're going to compare and contrast what life looks like when we don't trust in God, when what life looks like when instead we put our trust in other human beings or in ourselves, right? And then we're going to look at what life looks like when we trust in God and why it makes sense that Christians should live that kind of a life. So that's where we're going with this sermon. So, as we start, we're looking at the first point of our sermon, and the first point of our sermon is that fear of man hinders our relationship with God. Fear of man hinders our relationship with God. And so in our story, the person who demonstrates fear of man, people who are afraid of the power of human beings, that's demonstrated by Laban, the uncle. Right? And at first glance, that seems unlikely to us, right? Laban is the one with all the power in this relationship. Laban lives in an extremely patriarchal society. I'm not talking about like patriarchy in the sense that like modern feminists talk about patriarchy. I'm talking about in their families, the way that things were structured, like like you might have like 3 or 4 different family units that all live under the authority of one patriarch. And in this case, it's Laban. That means that everyone that Laban knows is either employed to Laban, is a slave of Laban, is a wife or a child of Laban, or in Jacob's case, a nephew of Laban, right? And you would think that someone who's in charge like this, that there's no reason for him to be afraid of human beings. He's the one in charge. Everybody answers to him. So how is it that we can say that Laban is governed by fear? But here's the thing. Those who are subject to power fear those in power, and those who have power are afraid of losing that power. Okay? Laban believes that the power to build or ruin a life ultimately rests in the power of human individuals. I'm going to say that one more time. Fear of man is the belief that ultimately the power to build up a life, the power to ruin a life, is held in the hands of human individuals. Right? In the passage that we read together, Laban opens with a position of desperation, right? So you guys, I'm preaching from like verses 20 to like 43 or something, but we only read a short portion of it. And what led up to that short portion is that Laban is desperate to retain the services of Jacob. And he tells Jacob, listen, I went and I got some divination done, right? Divination is a form of witchcraft. And this witch told me that I'm rich and successful today because you've been working for me for the last 14 years, right? But Jacob is tired of working for Laban and he wants to go back home. Right? Jacob has a big family now. He has 11 kids with 2 wives and 2 concubines because they were all competing for each other's, for Jacob's attention. And he's like, I've got a big family and I've been working 14 years, but I have nothing to show for it. I have nothing. So Laban, let me go back home. I want to go back home. And Laban says, no, please, Jacob. This witch told me that I'm blessed because of you. So name your wages and anything that you ask for, I'll pay it because it's going to be worth it for me. And then Jacob makes a bold gamble. He says, I don't want you to pay me a salary, okay? I don't want you to pay me every single, month or something like that, but I want a one-time payment, a one-time down payment where we go through your flocks and every lamb or goat that has spots or speckles or streaks on them, give them to me. Just a one-time down payment. And the reason he wants this is he says, I want to build capital. I want something of my own. I want to have a flock of my own. So I'll still take care of your flocks, and I'll take care of my flock at the same time, but just give me this. And for Laban, this makes a lot of sense. It's like, I would much rather just pay him one down payment for a long period of time, And When I pay him, when he said, I want all the lambs or goats with spots or streaks or speckles on them, he's like, oh, that's such a small minority of my flock, you know? There's like, most of them are all single color. Like all the sheep are white, all the goats are like brown. How many of them have spots? Not a whole lot. He's like, yeah, deal. And he shakes Jacob's hand and says, that's a deal, that's a deal. But then this is what Laban does. He turns around and walks out of the tent, and then he goes to his sons and he goes, guys, quick. I want you to go through my flocks as quick as possible and grab every single sheep or goat that you see with spots, speckles, or streaks and take them and go away on a 3-day journey and just go far away, right? So what's he doing? He's trying to get out of paying Jacob what they agreed on. They shook hands. They said, okay, this is the price. And then he went and then he's it's a classic bait and switch, right? He showed him like, oh, look at my flocks, and he's taking them away, right? This is what Laban is doing here is something really icky, really gross. It's a really bad move. And so I was trying to think of a scenario that would help you guys understand like how 억울해 this situation is, right? So I want you to imagine this. Like, let's pretend, okay, just in your imagination, let's pretend that your parents agree, like, okay, we're tired of giving you rides. We're gonna go and buy you a car. It's like, oh, okay. And obviously, this is a fantasy, but it's not a completely outlandish fantasy. They go and find you not a really really nice car, but a really really understandable car. You know. So right here, I think it's a 2009 Toyota Corolla. Okay, super reliable, good gas efficiency, and you not being a spoiled brat, you guys go to the dealership, you look around, and say, like, what about this? And you're like, okay, yeah. And then you get into the car and you sit in it. It smells clean. Nothing's crazy about the inside. It's not flashy, but it's clean and it works. And you go around and everything looks nice, everything's in order. And so your parents and the salesman go into the dealership and they shake hands and they sign the papers. And like, oh, and you're feeling good. Like, oh man, I can't believe it. My parents just bought me a car. That's the real American dream, you know? Like, my parents bought me a car. And you're so excited and you're making plans about where you're going to drive with your friends, like how you're going to, free life is going to be now. And then you step, and the dealership says, like, okay, congratulations, you're a car owner. We'll just bring it around front for you. And so you sit there and then you walk out of the doors, and instead of the car that you thought was going to be there, you see this car. And it's like, oh my goodness. And it's the same make and model. It's the same make and model, but there's definitely something wrong with this car. And it's clearly been in an accident or two. And you look a little closer and you're like, this cannot be the same car I just signed off on, right? You look and the tires are bald, and you sit inside and it smells like someone's been smoking in there for the last 15 years. And the mileage, there's like 300,000 miles on the odometer. You're like, what just happened? You got scammed. That's what just happened, right? And this is exactly what happened to Jacob. He goes to Laban, they shake on a deal, and then he turns around and he sees this. Instead of a sizable flock, he sees just a handful of sheep and goats that Laban might have missed. But what can he do about it? Right? There's no government out there. There's no police that he can report it to. The person who's the most in charge of anybody in their community is Laban, and he's the one who just scammed him. Right? And so we got to stop and think about this. Why does Laban do this? Right? Why does Laban do this? For Laban, he does not fear God at all. He doesn't fear God at all. He lives in a world where God is not the one who ultimately controls whether your life is built up or ruined. But for Laban, he lives in a world where he believes that your livelihood and your good fortune is entirely dependent on other people and your own smarts. And if your livelihood, if the quality of your life, if the survival of your family is ultimately dependent on something as fickle and intangible as human power, you will never have ultimate stability in your life. You cannot trust in other people because you know how dishonest and icky other people can be, right? You don't really trust yourself because you know, like, as smart as you are, as good at scamming other people as you are, there's a limitation on things, right? And so what do? Your life is about scarcity. Your life is about how little there is and how much you need to work to get what you want. And so you scrap and you claw and you bite and you hiss and you scratch and you try to gain any leverage you can over other people. Right? And this is why Laban is so willing to cheat and lie and steal, even if it's from his own nephew. With Laban, there is no fear of God. The decision for Laban about whether or not to do what's right, the decision about whether or not to lie, cheat, or steal, ultimately isn't anything to do with God, but it's a simple calculus in his brain where he thinks, what is there to gain? What do I risk? And can I get away with it? That's it for him. Operating in a world where fear of man trumps fear of God causes the Christian to miss out on the kind of life that can experience God's peace and God's power. And I want you guys to hear me carefully. I'm not saying that everybody who's not a Christian is like a dishonorable, scammy person like this. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that you guys see this kind of person more frequently than we care to admit. When I was in undergrad at UNC, I was a pre-med major, right? I was a biology major, and I'll be honest, I was not the best student, right? And pre-med was just kind of something that was there for me. But there were kids there who took it really serious, and they took it so seriously that they didn't think of their classmates as potential friends or people to collaborate with, but they thought of their classmates as primarily competition. And they thought to themselves, if this person does well, then they're going to mess up the curve and make it harder for me. And so there are people who would genuinely, like, you'd sit down and do study groups together and they wouldn't share notes. They're like, these are my notes. Why would I help you? There are people who would like actually try to sabotage you during study sessions. They like intentionally try to convince you of the wrong answer because they want to do well on the test and they want to make sure other people do poorly. There are people like this, and you might already know people like this in your schools, right? There's tons of people like this. There are people like this with friend groups that they think like, oh, if in our friend group everyone likes her more than she likes me, then all of a sudden my level goes down, and so I need to scrap and claw and try to be sneaky about making friends. This is really common. This is a scarcity mindset. This is a mindset of someone who does not trust God. There's no room for a God who loves and cares for his people in that mindset. Okay? And so the second point of this sermon that we're going to look at is, what does Jacob do about it? Right? What does Jacob do about it? And before we really look at what Jacob decides to do, we're going to look at what he doesn't do, okay? Because this is important for us to recognize. How does the worldly mind respond to wrongdoing? Right? How do people who don't trust in God, how do they respond to wrongdoing? Jacob could have responded in the way that a lot of teenagers decide to respond. And that first way is by despairing and throwing a pity party, right? What the Bible doesn't tell us is that Jacob goes home and pouts and complains to his wives like, listen to what Laban did to me today, right? I can't believe this. I don't get any chances. I try and I bust my butt and I work hard again and again and again, and Laban just doesn't like me. I can't live like this. I can't survive like this. This is unfair. And none of the things that he says is wrong, but throwing a pity party doesn't help either. Another thing that teenagers tend to do is that when they face situations where they feel something really ogure, is that they despair or throw a pity party, or they get really angry. They respond with anger and they try to take revenge. And this is something that Jacob could have done too, right? Jacob could have stood there and was like, oh, you want to play games, huh? Okay, we can play some games. Let me tell you, I used to be a trickster too. I used to be able to lie. You should have met me before I met God. Okay, let's bring that out. You know, hide the Bible if God's watching, right? Like this is something that Jacob could have done, and he could have fallen into this like, what's the word? Like he could have been really petty. He could have been really mean about it. He could have sabotaged his uncle's flocks. This is a way that Jacob could have responded, but he doesn't, right? And there's a problem with both of these responses. First of all, I'll say that it's usually not one or the other. A lot of times people decide to do both. They'll throw their pity party, and then they'll turn around and be angry, and they'll go back and being sad again, and go back and being angry. And here's the problem with this, is that the person who lives like this, who decides to respond to wrongdoing by relying on their own power, relying on their own ability to get them out of these situations, they learn to live in a toxic, mean, and ugly lifestyle. When we give in to despair, we start to think of ourselves primarily as victims. And it makes us anxious and sensitive, that everyone's out to get me, that nobody wants to be on my side. I just can't win, no matter what I do. And people who learn to fall into these habits of response, they learn to live a life that's very sensitive, very anxious, very towards a tendency towards like self-pity, right? And on the other hand, people who respond in anger and say like, oh, you're not going to mess with me like that. Do you know who I am? They turn into angry people. Some people you meet, they're just really angry at this drop of the hat. They're willing to fight. There's a growing genre of internet videos called like Karen videos, right? I'm sure you guys have seen some of these. Usually it involves some middle-aged woman who is like having a public freak out, trying to control some sort of situation. How do people turn into Karens? Right? They live like this, where they don't fear God, they don't trust that God has their back, and because God doesn't have my back, I need to control every little situation. And it's okay to apply immense pressure on other people because it means I'll get my way and I can control my life. And you fall into that belief. That's how the worldly mind responds to wrongdoing. But this is not a way to live. This is not a way to live. I think as children, we assume that you guys don't see anything wrong with the world, but that's very naive. I think all of you know adults who have grown up like this, who have given into self-pity and despair, who have primarily responded with anger, and now they're angry with everyone around them, right? My friends, I'm going to tell you this right now. This is not a way to respond to the troubles of this life. It'll make you an angry person, someone who's incapable of feeling the joy that God meant for you to live with. No one says, I want to be a Karen and goes out and does this sort of thing. They just become like that because that's how they learned how to live. The only way to face hardship in this life, the only way to find peace in the brokenness of this life, without becoming a self-centered, bitter, cynical, angry person, is to learn to live in this world as God intended for you to live in this world, trusting in Him and acknowledging that He is the one who has the power to build up lives or ruin them, that He is the one who decides these things, right? And we find this in Jacob's response to Laban's wrongdoing. And so the third point of this sermon is how do people who trust in God respond to wrongdoing? Right? How do people who trust in God respond to wrongdoing? You have very little control in your life. And that's not because you're a child. Even as an adult, I have very little control in my life. I can try my best to be on my best behavior. I can try my best to respond well to other people. I can even try to talk and act in ways to manipulate other people to do what I think I want them to do. But at the end of the day, I have no control over how other people choose to treat me. I can try to manipulate them, I can try to pressure them, I can try to play mind games with them, but at the end of the day, if that person decides, I'm angry with you, and walk up and punch me in the face, I have very little control about their decision to do so. And this is true for all of us, right? What we can control is our own response to evil and suffering in this world. Jacob's response to Laban's trickery is to entrust everything in God's hands, right? Jacob knows that he's powerless to appeal to a higher authority. Laban is the higher authority, right? Jacob knows that he can't start a fight because everyone's going to be on Laban's side. Jacob even looks at the flock that he has received, and he knows that mathematically, based on how genetics works, he's doomed and destined to a life of poverty because he just signed away all of his labor for this tiny little flock that Laban cheated him into, right? So what Jacob does is that he doesn't turn to worldly authority. He doesn't turn to natural authority. He turns to supernatural power. And he goes before God and he says, God, you see what I'm going through. You see the way that Laban is treating me, and you see what's happening to me. And so this is Jacob's plan. He cuts down some branches from some trees, and then he cuts stripes into those trees. And then this is his crazy plan. If we go to the next slide, there's an image of it, okay? He thinks of it like this, like, I'm going to put these tree branches up. Anytime that there's strong sheep that are about to mate, I'm going to hang these tree branches up, and when the sunlight shines through these branches and it hits the sheep, they'll at least look like they're spotted, right? They'll, at least in that moment, look like they have stripes, and then they'll mate and have babies. And hopefully, they'll have babies that are spotted and striped. Right? This is not scientifically viable. This is not like, there's nothing that tells Jacob that this is going to work. Like genetically, it makes no sense, right? All natural law tells it doesn't make any sense. But all Jacob has to work off of is a prayer and a hope. Right? He has a blessing that God promised him, that God would be with him wherever he goes, and eventually, somehow, some way, Jacob would have many descendants to receive the land of Canaan. He knows this. And he has a singular hope that I've met God, and I know God, and the God I met is all-powerful, and the God I met is good. And so my hope is that based on his character, maybe in this instance, I'll taste just a little bit of justice in my life. And miraculously, Jacob's plan works. Yeah, it's the Bible. It's crazy, right? It works. These sheep start having babies, even though both of them are like white sheep. They'll have a spotted baby. I was like, oh my God, thank you, right? And again, it keeps happening because God decides to answer Jacob's hope with kindness. And even though Jacob's plan is silly, even though Jacob's plan doesn't make any sense, God gives efficacy to it. And despite all odds, despite Laban's malicious intent, despite the mathematical improbability of things, Jacob's flock of spotted and streaked and striped sheep begins to grow. And God even goes so far as to make it so that justice prevails. And he says, Laban, you think you're going to cheat my Jacob? No. And Laban's flocks begin to diminish. And this is what God does for Jacob, right? And finally, I want to turn us to the last point of our sermon. Why do people who trust in God believe that it's worth it? Right? And you guys are all old enough, I think, where I can talk to you guys about this honestly, right? Does this mean that every single time that someone trusts in God, that God is going to respond and make justice happen in every single instance? No. I think you guys already know this. I think you guys have already seen this and experienced it in your own life, right? You go to school, you see someone getting bullied. You might even feel like, oh dang, that's really bad. You might pray in your heart like, God, can you do something about this? Nothing happens. He keeps getting bullied. You might go to school and someone sitting in the library is like, hey man, I got the answers to this test that's later in the next period. And you're like, man, these people are cheating. I hope they get caught. They never get caught. And they get into good colleges and they go and have happy lives. Right? Cheaters get away with cheating. Liars get away with lying. We live in a broken and messed up world. We know this. Right? People who are evil and wicked prosper. People who deserve to have good things happen in their life suffer. So the simple and short answer, does God always intervene and make sure that in every single instance justice prevails? The short and simple answer is no. Right? It happens all the time. And yet, when Jesus came in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, he teaches his disciples, when someone strikes you in the face, turn the other cheek. Right? And when he says to people like, if someone tries to sue you for your shirt, give them your cloak too. It's on the next slide. I think it's on the next slide. And he tells people, love your enemies, right? You used to hear people used to say, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is Jesus' ethic for the New Testament community. That if you belong to me, if you want to follow me, if you trust in God, then this is how I want you to live. And so we have to sit here and think, is this viable? Does this make sense? Can I go through life treating people who treat me with ill intent and want to harm me and turn the other cheek to them? Can I love those people and will life still make sense? Why does God ask us to do this? Why do Christians insist on living in a manner where we prioritize the fear of God over the fear of man? It will cost you to be a person of integrity. It will cost you. It will cost you to be someone who is intent on being honest in every situation. And yet God calls us to do it. So very quickly, 2 reasons why God still calls us to do this. Number one, God calls us to do this because we trust in God's justice. We trust in God's justice. Although trusting God and fearing God and committing to honesty doesn't always work out in every single situation in life, God is sovereignly working every single situation, every loss, every pain, every moment of injustice towards his ultimate glory and towards his plan of redemption for this world. Meaning that even though you might lose next time, and even though you might lose again the time after that, if we trust in God, he will bring about a situation where ultimately every evil, every injustice is answered for perfectly in his plan of redemption and judgment on this earth. So we trust in God in the midst of evil and wrongdoing because we hope in God's justice. Secondly, we trust in God because it shows that we hope in his ultimate plan of salvation. Right? And this is where I really want you guys to pay attention. Okay, I'm wrapping up right after this. This is the last point of this sermon. When we say to God, I can't trust you because bad things happen to good people, it shows that we don't really understand what has happened in the gospel. It shows us that we really don't understand what's going on in the entire story of the Bible. It shows our ignorance to the world, to God, that we don't get it. Because fundamentally, the very first sin, and every sin after that, was exactly that problem. God, I don't trust you, so I'm going to do what I think is best. And secondly, it shows that we don't understand the cross. Because if I tell God, I don't trust you because bad things happen to good people, and I don't see how there can be any possible good that comes out of it, we show that we don't understand that at the cross, the bad thing happened to a good person. The absolute worst thing happened to Jesus Christ, who did nothing wrong. And God decided this moment of injustice is the foundation upon which I'm going to build all salvation. That if you can't handle this, then you don't get it. God's goodness doesn't have to be in every single situation and circumstance where it turns out for a victory in our own eyes. That God is even capable of taking this great evil and injustice and turning it for our good and for his glory. So if the Christian who claims to trust in God has been saved by such an act of injustice carried out unfairly upon the Son, and if our God was able to take such a great evil and spin it for our good, for our salvation, and for his glory in it, then what makes you think that the evil that you face in your life is somehow more irredeemable? Instead, let us be wronged for our integrity. Let us be losers who pay the cost for our honesty, if that's what it means to trust in God. Right? And let us glorify God that he counted us worthy of suffering alongside his Son. Right? This is all the time that we have together. I'm going to wrap up our sermon here. And I'll invite praise team to help us wrap up. Yeah. And we'll pray. Father God, we thank you for this word that you shared with us. God, we thank you for this instance where you showed that you care for your people and that you're looking for our good, even when other people are looking to cheat and wrong us. Father God, teach us to really trust in you, God. Let us put our hope and our trust in you, that the quality of our lives isn't dependent on what other people say or decide, that ultimately the quality of my life is not dependent upon some college admissions committee somewhere out there. It's not dependent on what my friends decide about me behind my back. It's not dependent on what my teachers think about me. But God, what matters most is what you think about us. God, help us to trust you in this. God, there are times where we face great evil and where we face injustice in our lives. God, help us not to shrink away in fear and worry about what people think, but instead help us to look to your face and gain our security based on what you say about us. We pray this in Jesus' name, amen.